but the implication is that if we, as the reader, were also able to do this, we ourselves would be able to enter this book. So I could see people like getting super into this idea of like, we just gotta believe enough to enter Fantastica.
You didn't believe enough, apparently. Nothing else happened from
Did
here
you
on
enter
for you?
Fantastica?
Yeah. It's what's considered an eighth wall break.
Welcome, friends, to episode 191 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Mikael Inda's 1979 novel, The Never-Ending Story. All right, James, here we are. You promised it last week. Go ahead and regale our listeners with a rendition of the song.
Never-ending story.
Just that alone, I think, is worth it. I actually don't remember the tune of it. I'm gonna be excited to watch the movie and have that.
Oh, you'll remember it.
Reminder.
Once we watch it, it'll be lodged in there real nice, deep.
Perfect. Like, my only memory of it right now is coming from Stranger Things, who references it.
Yeah.
Which,
wait, you're saying
perfect.
Your only memory of any of this story, or just the song?
No, just the song. Like, I remember some of the movie, but the music, for whatever reason, wasn't something that lasted in my brain.
Okay.
I'm sure it'll be unlocked when we watch it, and I'll be like, oh yeah. But yeah, I'd never read this book before. First time. How about you?
Oh, never read the book before, yeah. And honestly, I think this is one of those projects, before we made a podcast, I wouldn't have even known that it was based on a book, even though it clearly seems like it should be. You know, it feels like a story that's so book-centric.
It kind of does. It also, I don't know about you, but I kept thinking of The Princess Bride during
Me
this.
too. Yeah, totally. I was going to make that
There's so many
comparison.
similarities in the meta framing narratives and what it's talking about with storytelling and all this stuff. And we love that book, and we had this awesome time covering it. So if you're interested in more of the same kind of stuff, check out those episodes. But this is also very different than that story. I was kind of expecting the framing device to be something that was created by the filmmakers, and the story itself to just be what was contained within the book. But that is not the case at all. And in fact, it's the book goes even farther with the framing than the movie, and to my memory at least, even touches on.
I actually don't remember the movie that well.
Me
Going
either.
through, I was trying to. I'm pretty sure this is the book. The movie's fairly faithful to what we just read, I would assume, for the most part, for up to a certain point. But yeah, I mean, for whatever reason, I remember the movie being very, very New York. It felt very in a big city, and this felt like more, I don't know. He was at some sort of English school or something. It felt more European to me.
More Europe. I mean, he's European, so that makes sense. He's German. Yeah. I think he was living in Rome at the time. But I mean, that could be the case. He was not happy with the film, which we could talk about a little bit here. He even tried to sue the production to get it stopped when he found out how many changes they were going to make to it. And he was unsuccessful. Obviously, we got the movie made. But yeah, Mikael Inda, not a huge fan of this film, which has gone on to have a cult following and be sort of this classic that people look back on fondly.
And I have a analysis on this at this point. I feel like this story is one that was made to be nostalgic for people who read these sort of on the tracks, on a quest. You know what I mean? Very one path to the journey is the journey, and you have to do this thing and retrieve this thing and get this. I think those sort of really simple fantasy stories, I think this was almost framed as a nostalgia device for people who read those growing up. And I don't know this is a very mature novel necessarily, but it doesn't feel like the same thing because of the metatextual nature of it. And then it's interesting for me to think about it in terms of being nostalgic for the film that was made in the 80s when it was already sort of being nostalgic for something even before that, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting layers there, right? Because the movie is tapping into that old kind of classic fantasy. I can see inspirations from fantasy that came before this, but I mean, this is an old novel, 1979, so it's also itself, I think, very influential. I kept thinking about how it may have affected other things. I mean, it may have affected Princess Bride.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know.
You know, things that it brings up for me too is something that was really big for me and still is to this day is video games, and the way that like the linear storytelling path that some games will take. You know, your sandbox games and everything, but you have those stories that are really on rails, and you're experiencing a journey. And it feels like, you know, go here, defeat this boss, retrieve this item, and then it'll allow you to go here. And it kind of could be the early storytelling formats for a lot of like video games.
Yeah. Well, I want to correct myself. I just looked it up. The Princess Bride came out in 1973, the book, originally, which we know we reread some later editions where he like added to it. So it could not have been an influence of that. So we got to give William Goldman his due. But yeah, I like that point about video games. There is a sort of interactive nature, you know, and this predates video games really. So it's like the idea of this like getting into the story and affecting things. And I don't want to get into any spoilers here. I know we've kind of touched on some meta stuff and that might be spoiler adjacent, but we won't give specifics. I also have some interesting stuff about Mikhail, which first off, apologies if I mispronounce any of this stuff. I'm trying to pronounce like German names. I'm not very used to that, so I'll do my best. And then there's tons of wild fantasy names, which I'm sure I'll mangle, but I feel less bad about that. But before we get into it, just generally, like, what was your experience like reading this book? Pros and cons. What did you like? Was there anything you didn't like?
Yeah.
What were your thoughts?
I enjoyed like sort of this nostalgic journey. I was thinking about the fact that there's so many books that I read that are this sort of fantasy format where it's in a fantasy world with crazy fantasy names and princesses and dragons and all this stuff that I don't even remember the name of reading growing up. You know what I mean? There's like like some
it's like
stories,
unknown books you read at some point, and
yeah,
just like,
that I have no idea the titles of and things like that. No idea when I read them, but it made me nostalgic for those sort of stories. And when I wasn't necessarily like, I was just willing to read whatever if it had like a dragon in it, and it, you know, like I was very forgiving if it wasn't maybe the most well written book, but
yeah, for me it was Tor. It was like if I saw the Tor symbol on the spine.
Yeah.
In a bookstore, I was like, "Oh, this is going to be something I'm going to like." It was a combination of like two things. It had the Tor symbol on it, and then there was usually a dragon on the cover, and I was like, "This is a book for me."
Nice. So that that portion I liked sort of reliving some of that, but then there were parts of this that I feel like lived up to the title Neverending Story, and maybe it was because I was coming in with the knowledge of the movie, but it felt like there were certain like conclusion points and sort of truncated sections that could have been made. But again, that's in keeping with sort of the fantasy theme here. Is like some of them, so especially I would say probably older fantasy novels, tended to just kind of meander through the story and like not worry too much about like how well plotted it was. I don't know. I guess I started to feel the weight of the story at some point. It just felt like I was.
Yeah, I think you're talking about pacing issues, and
yeah.
I completely agree. I think especially in the second half of the book, it starts to drag. I think it has some pretty significant pacing issues, but I do want to begin with positives though. This book, to me, the stuff that it's about and tackling it in a children's book is really interesting because it is about the magic of reading, and it is about this like secret life of stories, and it's surreal, and it starts to become about the relationship between a reader and the material. And I love the idea of like the intermingling of the two, like how truly the reader breathes life into the words, and I think that's true. Any writer, knows that you only do half the work, and the other half is left to the reader. Every reader will bring their own, perspective and biases and everything else with them when they pick up whatever material, and they'll read a different story. Like every reader reads something slightly different just based off of that alone. And I think more so in books than you get in like a movie. I feel like movies, obviously there's lots of areas for interpretation, but the nature of having so many things you can like see and point to and go, look at that, versus the interpretive nature of text, right? Like it all exists in the realm of our imagination, which is what this book's all about.
It feels to me like filmmakers take their interpretation of what they're reading off the page and give you their experience of having read something. So they're like, this is my version.
It's like, this is what I imagined, so I'm going to put it on screen. Yeah, and that's what this book's all about. So if you like the idea of like that distinction being made almost literal and turned into a magic system and turned into world building, that's what happens. And we get this really cool framing device of this young boy going into a bookstore, finding this book, steals it, and then he's reading it, and then it's very over the top, like you were saying, very old classic style, almost sword and sorcery feel, fantasy, and then it starts to twist a little bit, and it starts to become apparent that he is in some ways affecting the story, and the story is in some ways reflecting him and interacting with him. Mm-hmm. And the characters inside the story can start to get glimpses of him and vice versa. And my mind was getting blown, and I'm so into it. And like somewhere around the midway point, I'm not sure exactly where it feels like the end of the book, and it feels like we start a second book. Agreed, so I completely agree with you there. I think this book would benefit from being split into 2 volumes. But because it's not, I sort of get adrift towards the middle, and it starts to drag. There's a lot that starts to happen that doesn't feel as important for various reasons we'll get into. And then it starts to recoup, I think, towards the end. I think it comes back around. It has some really interesting lessons, and I like the way it ends. But there is a bit of a slog chunk in this book that is a little bit tough, and it's the one like misgiving I have about the book that keeps me from giving this like glowing recommendation. Everyone should go read it, because I was ready to give it that pretty early on because I was loving everything. But then that just holds it back a bit for me.
Yeah, we're just traveling to too many locations too quickly. It feels like we're just kind of like flying by situations and going back to places we've been before, and all of it just so much. It felt like it could definitely have used another additional, I don't know, been its own book, and it had an additional like 50 pages or something to sort of like slow things down a little bit, because I feel like the pacing isn't the same in the first half and in the second half. It doesn't feel like the same kind of book.
I have some interesting like theories about why that may be the case, which we can get into once we get into actual spoilers.
The way that this story sort of engaged with like losing yourself in a fantasy story, how that can be so exciting and magical, and then how at some points it can be, overtaking your life, and like how anything and stories in general can start to become a negative, and it's sort of like your real life and the world that you live, and all these books and all this entertainment that you consume, like they can coexist. But there is a fine line somewhere to sort of still address the things that are going on in your own life, and then lose yourself in a fantasy story for the escapism sometimes, and how the two can reflect each other as well. Like you can learn something about yourself that can help you deal with something in your real life in a fantasy story that you were never expecting to learn. And I do like that like sort of lesson for people who are reading it that way.
I love that too. It's not just all rosy, right? It's not just all about how great stories are. They're the best. Let's just, revel in how great stories are. There's a bit of that, but then you're right. There is definitely also here's the dangers of it. You can lose yourself. You can, if you start to fail to take the lessons that you learn in the fiction and apply them to your life, then you'll lose your memory, and you'll sort of become hollowed out, and you'll become distance from yourself, your true self, I guess. And there's a danger to that. And then also the idea of like fiction has this power to change belief and to change people's minds. But it is shown as being both a positive and a negative. Like it can also be what will lead people to do evil things and lead people down the wrong path. So it's not shown as like a purely good thing. It's both good and dangerous, depending on how it's dealt with. And I think that's a really cool message, and a very nuanced, complicated one to have in a children's novel. Yeah. Which, I think is cool. I think I would have really liked this as a kid. I'm kind of sad I didn't read it as a kid.
I thought the same thing. The way that I think it's really beautiful that like art can do that, right? Like if you sat someone down and you had different beliefs than them and you had a conversation, they might not, it's almost too confrontational. And the way that like art can sort of like let someone experience this in a passive, like subliminal way, almost even sometimes, like to sort of clearly this main character is present enough to know like things are going on in his life and things aren't great with his father and all of this. And then as time goes on, it's cool to see like he can't confront that in the real world, but he finds escape in this story. And then eventually that does help him, sort of work through the puzzle to figure out his life. So yeah, I love that.
I do recommend this book for anybody who that sounds interesting. Like but I will say, if you're the kind of person who's turned off by too much like meta analysis, if it feels like too on the nose, like talking about what stories are, like if that frustrates you, if you don't like the framing device in the Princess Bride, things like that, then you might struggle with this book. And then also just be prepared for a bit of a slog in the middle. But otherwise, I do recommend the book. I think it's cool. It goes a lot of places that the movie doesn't go. We'll know more next week when we rewatch it, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more.
I do think if you're a fan of the movie that you should give this a shot, because it is really interesting the way that it like sort of the things that you're familiar with from the first movie, it sort of extrapolates on some of those, and it kind of gives better context. At least in my memory, I don't remember how well all of this, I don't know. I don't remember it being explained as well as in the book. So there's something nice about that. And honestly, if you're a fan of fantasy and remembered reading a lot of fantasy growing up, then I think that you would get a kick out of it. It's fun to like, the nostalgia ride is there if you want to take it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the author, Michael Andres Helmuth Ende. The only time I'm going to say that whole full name. Hopefully I got that somewhat right. He is the son of a surrealist painter named Edgar Ende, born in Bavaria, but moved to the artist quarter of Munich when he was a young boy. So he was born in 1929. He would grow up during World War II, which was incredibly influential onto his work. His father's paintings were deemed degenerate and banned by the Nazi Party. His father had to continue to work in secret and hide a lot of his art because it was illegal. He experienced, Mikhail experienced his first air raids at the age of 12. And this is an interesting bit, which was reminding me a little bit of what we covered, our previous project, Slaughterhouse-5. This was him reflecting on the first time he saw these air raids that took place in Munich. Our street was consumed by flames. The fires didn't crackle, it roared. The flames were roaring. I remember singing and careering through the blaze like a drunkard. I was in the grip of a kind of euphoria. I still don't truly understand it, but I was almost tempted to cast myself into the fire like a moth into the light. So that's interesting, right? Like the pull of this destruction, and then I think we see that reflected in this book with the nothing, which we can talk to. We see people sort of getting pulled to go towards the nothing, which I know we haven't gotten to spoilers yet. So, but this is a thing that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting though how we have this connection, right? Two projects back to back. The authors heavily influenced by the bombings in World War II.
When I was reading the book, I was thinking about making a joke on the podcast about how we went from Slaughterhouse-5 to something very different, and how like, oh, can you believe how different these really are? And it's always interesting how like our projects tend to have like some sort of connective tissue along the way somewhere or another.
This one absolutely does. Like you said, they're ostensibly different, but they're also both form breaking in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And about what it means to tell a story in different ways. So there's a lot of connective tissue there. So Mikhail was drafted at the age of 14 to join the Axis powers, the Nazis, in war against the Allies. 3 of his friends would die in their first day as they joined the service, by the way. But he tore up his draft papers and instead joined a resistance movement that sabotaged the SS. And he served as a courier throughout the remainder of the war for this resistance movement. So,
jeez, that's hardcore.
Pretty badass, I think.
Badass.
Props to him. After the war, he became a playwright and an actor. In 1952, he would meet the actress Inberg Hoffman. Probably mispronounced that. At a party. She was 8 years older than him, but he ended up winning her over with his love of poetry and he found her just fascinating from everything I was reading. And it would be years later, but they would end up getting married. And she became a very important part of his creative life because she would help him with his writing. She encouraged him to finish projects. Very involved, it seemed like, in his creative work. So in 1959, he would publish a play, but it wouldn't be until 1960 that his first novel would come out. Now, this novel was called Jim Button, and it was, I believe, a children's fantasy story. He had tried to get it published for many years and received just countless rejections. Stop me if you've heard this before in the journey of an author, right? Like, this is so common. Countless rejections. Finally, he got accepted by this small, like, independent publisher who was going to, and they forced him to split it into 2 volumes. It was overly long, and he finally agreed to do that. The first one came out in 1960, and it went on to win the Berlin Literary Prize for Youth Fiction, which all of a sudden sort of put him on the map, and he became able to, like, pay off his back rent that he was, like, in court over, and all this stuff. Like, he was really struggling at the time, and then turned it all around with the publication of this book. His wife would also help urge him to join the humanistic movement, and so he would campaign for peace. Became an outspoken demonstrator, went around to different protests and stuff, and him and his wife were, I don't know, I just think it's really cool that they were humanists, and that's something that I really like, and that's a thing that I ascribe to, so very cool to see that from these two. So he would write The Neverending Story in 1979. Unfortunately, his wife died unexpectedly from a pulmonary embolism when she was 63 in 1985. So he went through this tragedy, and the movie is coming out, and from everything I was reading, he was not happy about the changes that were being made. He tries to sue to get the production stopped, or to fix it and not change everything. Like, I think he really wanted the second half of the book included. I felt like it was essential to the story, but he lost the suit, and the movie ended up getting made. So he was not a fan of it, which that's sad to see, especially when it goes on to have this great following. One thing that's also interesting is that he was fascinated by Japanese culture. He traveled to Japan many times, and he ended up remarrying after his wife died. I think after 4 years after her death, he remarried a translator who worked on translations of his book from German into Japanese. And his books are incredibly popular, not only in Germany, but in Japan. Apparently, he's more famous for his books in both Germany and Japan than the film, which is what most English speakers know The Neverending Story as. Wow.
That's cool.
So for whatever reason, it's just not quite as popular as a book for us English speakers, but in Japan, apparently very, very popular. His works have been translated into more than 40 languages, sold more than 35 million copies, and have been adapted into motion pictures, stage plays, operas, and audiobooks. Anda is one of the most popular and famous German authors of the 20th century, mostly due to the enormous success of his children's fiction. He was not strictly a children's writer, as he wrote books for adults as well, and Anda's writing can be described as a surreal mixture of reality and fantasy. And I was looking at some of the paintings of his father. It is, I don't know that I've seen it before, but it's of a kind I have, like that surrealist movement, that like Salvador Dali, like that kind of stuff. Really fascinating, a little bit darker, I would say, than a lot of the Dalis I've seen. Very cool. And to think about his father, who's like having to secretly paint, labeled a degenerate, and then his son who grows up and has this book that's all about the nature of art and its power and how it interacts with us. And I don't know, I just feel like he had a ton to say and a lot of interesting ideas about imagination and the power that art has and the role that it plays in our society and in our lives. And when I think about all of that, it makes me like this book even more.
Me too, yeah. The idea of having a surrealist painter as a father and just like walking around the house and seeing these, and how that must like inform so much of your life and like what that, I don't know, the way that you approach art, and clearly it did have an effect.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the fantasy in this book feels almost surrealist, like a surrealist painting, like loosely explained, bizarre, just like strung together and loosely connected. Things don't like make logical sense sometimes. It just go with it. Like, so I could totally see that influence. We got to move on to talk about the plot, but I just want to end on this quote. I thought that two quotes that I thought were really interesting. One, when talking about his writing, he said, quote, "It is for this child in me and in all of us that I tell my stories." And then he went on to say, "My books are for any child between 80 and 8 years old." So, nice. You know, again, he faced a lot of criticism from people who were saying he's not like a serious literary mind because he wrote for kids. And that was something he pushed back against for a long time. And that he said, you know, writing fantasy and writing children's literature in particular, like a lot of people didn't want to take him seriously as a writer. And I could see that was very frustrating. Also, did not have any children of his own. I don't know if there was a reason for that, but I think it's interesting when you consider like Dr. Seuss we talked about didn't have any kids. Like some of these children's authors, I think Where the Wild Things Are, Marie Sendak, also no children. So, you know, it's interesting, like this reclaiming of youth by these authors who don't have children of their own. I don't know. It seems like there's an interesting correlation there, at least.
Yeah, definitely. So you were talking about darkness in the father's painting too, which I want to say, like this story does have an undercurrent of some pretty dark stuff. And it allows, and I think that's to be respected in some children's stories too. Like, I think kids, you know, I'm just going to say this in this episode and we can readdress it in the film episode. Like, this story terrified me and made me face my mortality, I think, for maybe the first time in my entire life.
Yeah.
And like, the story has that in there. You know, it's not just the film that does that. So I think it's to be respected when you take it seriously and have danger and like death potentially and some of that other stuff in these stories, because it is formative for kids and you know, it lends it a lot more weight because it's realistic in that way.
Yeah, I mean, very heavy. There's a point early on where Bastian goes into this bookstore and the guy, Coriander, I believe, the guy who's owning the store, tells him, "We don't have any books for children here." And I just thought it was a cool little nod to how, like, when you're a kid, like, you want to read. I wanted to read adult stuff, you know, like I want to, and so the idea that like he's kind of saying like what we're reading isn't really a children's book, even though ostensibly it is. I don't know. It's kind of operating at this instant space between what you would expect for a children's book and definitely a lot more adult or serious topics.
Yeah, and even just outside of like mortality stuff, like there's plenty of dark, really ominous, like existential threats and things that as a kid you're like, holy shit, like what the fuck is going on?
Yeah. And you know, and maybe some of it to the detriment of the story for a child, you know, who's reading this. I can see that maybe some of it would be above your head, or you might find it a little bit boring. I don't know. Like, I wish I could like have you know, a 12-year-old me chime in on the podcast and let me know what he thought of it, because I think it would be a very different read than what I was able to take away now from it, you know?
The things when I was a kid that went over my head that I sort of just read by, and yes, they went over my head, but I still ended up overall, as I said, sort of just pushing through anything I was reading and basically just enjoying reading anything.
Yeah.
So it's like, even if it did go over a kid's head, I wonder if it would bother them, you know, or they'd just be like, oh yeah.
Well, one thing I think that plays in the benefit for a kid is I took everything at face value in a sense when I was young reader. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is also when I would read a fantasy book and it was like, there was a dragon, I'm like, okay, there's a dragon. And I picture the dragon, and that dragon was real to me. And I was like imagining what it would be like. And I didn't question it. I didn't compare it because I hadn't read a ton of stuff. So I wasn't like, well, how did this dragon stack up to this other dragon I read about? You know, what's the technique being? Like, I didn't know enough about writing. So like,
well, and it's like, did the dragon represent something else? Like, was the dragon a metaphor or an allegory for something in life?
I'm not thinking about that. It's a fucking dragon, you know? And I was like astounded at the idea of something weird, you know? And there's lots of weird shit in this book. And I think if you're the kind of kid who can just full bore go into it and let your imagination run wild and embrace everything that he's describing, there's a ton of weird stuff in here, and it would feel like my brain was exploding a little bit, and maybe a little bit overwhelming, but you know, I could see being very cool. And in some places that was a bit of a stumbling block for me now, because I kind of can see the code of the story, and I know what he's trying to accomplish, and I know what seems to be important and what seems to not be important. And there were times where I was like, I don't know if this is actually important for me, and I would get a little bit, less engaged. So, I don't know. It's interesting how different I am as a reader now, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, we're just jaded now.
Yeah. One thing I did see that I thought was interesting from a writing point of view is him talking about being a pantser. And that doesn't surprise me with the nature of this story a little bit. Now, he's specifically talking about writing his first novel, Jim Button, but he says, I sat down at my desk and wrote, quote, "The country in which the engine driver Luke lived was Morrowland. It was a rather small country. Once I'd written the 2 lines, I hadn't a clue how the 3rd line might go. I didn't start out with a concept or a plan. I just let myself drift from one sentence and one thought to the next. That's how I discovered that writing could be an adventure. The story carried on growing. New characters started appearing, and to my astonishment, different plot lines began to weave together. The manuscript was getting longer all the time and was already much more than a picture book. I finally wrote the last sentence 10 months later, and a great stack of paper had accumulated on my desk." I think that's interesting because that shows sort of his method, right? Of just following his strings of thought. And
remember that part that I was saying we were jumping from place to place and going all over? I think I know why now.
Yeah, he's just going. He's not plotting this out. He's not thinking about any sort of structure to me. He's just like, I'm just going to write the next thing and then the next thing and then this thing happens and then this thing happens. And there gets to be a lot of that at times where it's like, they go on adventures, and then this one thing leads to the next thing, and leads to the next thing, and they're loosely connected, and it doesn't really feel like there's this big plan necessarily at work all the time. But, it comes back around, and like I said, it has a satisfying ending, so props to him for being able to do that, because that can be very difficult. I also am a bit of a pantser when it comes to my writing. I wouldn't say I'm quite like this. I'm somewhere in the middle. I try and have some plans about where I'm going to go without necessarily knowing everything. But this is very like, I don't even know anything. I'm just writing sentence after sentence. And that can be very difficult to do, to write into the darkness like that.
Yeah, I assume at some point he must have thought, okay, I have an ending in mind, and it's just sort of like getting there.
Maybe.
I would assume, because what are you thinking about when you lay in bed at night? Like just only the next thing and not the eventual conclusion?
I don't know. I mean, everybody's different. There are writers who do it that way, and writers don't only know the ending when they get there. Sometimes,
Yeah.
And then there are lots of writers who swear by knowing the ending before they ever write the beginning, they feel like that is an absolute must, and they if they want to be able to finish something, they have to know where they're going. So, and then you have people who meticulously plot every single thing, like a Brandon Sanderson, famous for plotting out his books. Like he plots out every chapter, and then he plots out like every beat, like story beats within the chapters, and he has this big skeleton before he sits down to write his books. There's lots of different approaches, and there's different pros and cons, I think. And then I think a lot of it just has to do with like how the author's mind works. Because that, to me, like I think about that and I'm like, that could never work for me. So it's just like, my brain doesn't work that way. And a lot of people's don't. So, I think it's more about finding what works for you, which is something I'm still trying to do, I should say. Always on a, never ending, journey to find how to do that. So we got to get into some plot here. So the book centers on a boy, Bastian Balthazar Books, an overweight and strange child who is neglected by his father after the death of Bastian's mother. While escaping from bullies, Bastian bursts into the bookstore of Carl Conrad Coriander, where he finds a book called The Never-Ending Story. Unable to resist, he steals the book and hides in his school's attic, where he begins to read. The story Bastian reads is set in the magical land of Fantastica, a place of wonder ruled by the benevolent and mysterious childlike Empress. A great delegation has come to the Empress to seek her help against a formless entity called the Nothing. The delegates are shocked when the Empress's physician, a centaur named Charon, informs them that the Empress is ill and has chosen a boy warrior named Atreyu to find a cure. Upon finding Atreyu, Charon gives him Orin, a powerful medallion that protects him from all harm. At the advice of the giant turtle Morla, the Aged One, Atreyu sets off in search of an invisible oracle known as Ululala, who may know the Empress's cure. In reaching her, he is aided by a luck dragon named Falkor, whom he rescues from a creature, Yggdrasil the Many. By Ululala, he is told the only thing that can save the Empress is a new name given to her by a human who can only be found beyond Fantastica's borders. Okay.
I was trying so hard not to laugh.
So many names, and they're wild names.
Yeah, for sure. To be expected, I guess, in a fantasy story like this. Do you think that he thought he was really clever when the character's last name was Books, B-U-X?
Maybe. I don't know. Here's the other thing we should also say. We are reading the translated version of this, not in the original German. So
that's true.
I don't know how much of this. One thing that was really interesting in my copy of the book, and I'm sure in all copies, every chapter begins with like a big letter. Like this is a frequent thing where like the big letter is the first letter of the first word in that chapter, but it's A through Z in order. So the very first chapter begins with a big A, the second letter begins with a big B, and it goes all the way to Z. The final chapter begins with a big awesome. Z.
I didn't even realize that.
And what's interesting is like, how do they translate that? Like German uses the same general alphabet as we use, so I wonder if that must be true in the German case as well, and that must have been a challenge of translation to make sure everything still made sense, but yet could maintain that trick. I don't know.
Well, yeah, you're gonna have to make some choices, right, to change words in that way and be so specific. Yeah, but, maybe they just started it with like a basic word. I don't know.
Well, sometimes it is. Yeah. A lot of times it's a name. I don't know like to what end, other than just being. It's kind of cool. I guess it's like it kind of gave me a sense of like, oh, I'm curious to see how he's gonna do the next one. So I was kind of curious for that reason. It's fun. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about it. Like this entrance into the story, Bastian. Maybe let's start with the framing device. What did you think of Bastian and his journey into the bookstore?
I loved it, honestly, and I'm not ashamed to admit that like I was really getting sucked into his story. And then when we first jumped into the fantasy story, I was like, oof, here we go, because I was kind of like really fascinated with what was going on there, and I loved the sort of like heist that he did, and I guess it wasn't a heist, he didn't plan it, but he stole the book, and the way the interactions they were having, and he's like hiding in the attic, and I just found it to be really engaging. And then part of it is cool because I was looking forward to when we would click back out of the fantasy story to check in, and eventually I did. I clicked into the fantasy story as well, but I just love that framing device. I thought that was a lot of fun. And I also loved, there's a specific part where it's being talked about, like, if you haven't ever, like, snuck under the sheets to, like, read a book when you were supposed to be asleep or something like that. Like, that being said, like, that, I did that so many times. Yeah. And it's funny in hindsight to think, like, of course we need to get our sleep or whatever, but, like, I'm sure parents nowadays would be overjoyed with their kids, like, sneaking to read books and stuff. I don't know. Yeah. But that was something that, like, I very obviously did, and I thought that was pretty nice to get a shout out like that.
I agree. Many a late night spent under a blanket with a flashlight or something, hoping not to, catch any attention while I'm trying to read.
And it's not comfortable either.
It's not. But you're a kid, so like your neck can like sit in a terrible angle for hours and you'll be fine.
You're having to hold the book up sometimes and you can't get a good angle to read what's happening in the flashlight. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I mean, again, I think we've talked about this before. It's smart to make the main character a reader, like especially for a kid. It's like you're reading it and you're like, ooh, I'm like that. I like books. I'm like this bastard. You immediately see yourself, right, in this character. Yep. There was a line where he talks about how he hates it when authors talk about humdrum people living humdrum lives. He's like, talk to me about the fantasy world. That's all I care about. Yeah. And of course it's super meta because that's exactly what's happening every time we touch back in with Bastian, who is in, his humdrum life. So I love that he sort of lampshades it there. And that kind of little playfulness, I think is super cool throughout. And every time it happened, I liked it. But yeah, I mean, I kind of remember some of these characters. I remember the big rock guy. That's one that definitely stands out. I think I remember there being a big rock bicycle, which is very silly and weird. And I think I remember that's in the movie.
I don't remember that.
And then like the one guy rides on a snail and the other guy's on a bat. Right. These three messengers. And I thought they were going to be more important characters. But like a lot of characters, other than maybe Atreyu and Falkor, Like they get introduced, they do some stuff, and then they go away, and then like they rarely sort of circle back and become important again.
Yeah, which it's nice for layering in characters and world building in that way, but also some of the time, like you said, I could kind of feel that these characters weren't going to stick around, and I was like, all right, let's see what's going to happen next.
Yeah. What's going to happen with Atreyu? Which, by the way, in case anyone is aware of the band Atreyu, it is named after this character.
Oh, sweet! I didn't know that like was confirmed. That's awesome.
Yeah. They named it after this character.
Very cool.
Very cool.
Which apparently within the story, I don't know if it means this in some other language, but Atreyu means like raised by the people instead of being. So I like that. That's cool.
Yeah, and Bastian sees a lot of himself in Atreyu, yet he doesn't feel like he's as. It's like an aspirational version of himself because he's like, oh, I'm not as like fit, and I'm not as brave, and I'm not as, all this stuff as him. But we're both sort of raised by the community, and he felt like after his mother died, that was true for him as well. And he feels distance from his father, who is clearly suffering from depression. I think it's described how like nothing matters to him. Everything's sort of, he's lost all joy, and he doesn't seem to care. You'll just find him like staring off into space instead of watching TV and stuff like that. And then you see the sort of force behind the destruction of this world is the nothing, and it's described as this sort of like deletion. It's this like, it is truly nothingness that is swallowing things up. I
love the way it was described as like, if you were to look at it, it almost feels like going blind, like or like the way that it's not even that you're like seeing something black or anything come towards you. It's like a lack of anything. Yeah,
which is something we talked about this, I think, in Howl's Moving Castle. I think the door was described as being like that, and it's one of those things you can't really imagine, and you can't put it on a screen, so it can exist in this realm of imagination. I thought it was really interesting how he would encounter people who'd like lost limbs to it, and they would say that it wasn't painful, that whatever went in there was just gone now. Which is like kind of chilling. I don't know. It's like a spooky to me.
Yeah, I definitely had a moment where I was thinking about that too. I was like, damn, like what would that be like?
Yeah. And I don't know, to me, it does seem to represent like a depression, like that sort of like lack of joy and just like being very blah. Like,
it's literally sucking the life out of everything.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Atreyu gets introduced now. Atreyu in the book is this like green skinned, like plains warrior, but a child. He's like 10 years old, and he gets tasked with this quest to go find a way to cure the child empress. And he goes on this quest, and we follow him, and we meet Falkor, which by the way, like I think is one of the probably most famous fantasy dragons out there. I think probably in the top 10, 15.
Yeah, dog dragon.
Yeah, this dog dragon. It's the luck dragon is described in the book. He talks. He doesn't have big floppy ears in the book, I don't think, which is how I kept imagining him, because that's what he has in the movie.
The entire time I was imagining Falkor from the movie.
Very interested to see that again, because I love dogs and I love dragons, and I liked Falkor a lot. But I also remember it being kind of weird and unsettling. Like it was like this weird blend of the two, and the way that puppetry is a little bit like uncanny. So I remember it's like, as much as I liked Falkor, I was also like afraid of Falkor a little bit.
Right.
So
this movie goes deep for me. There's a lot of roots of trauma in this, almost like there's like so I like this. I watched this movie a lot. We'll talk about it more, and it also reminds me of a movie like Labyrinth, or like The Dark Crystal, like watching these like it's amazing practical effects and everything that's going on, the puppetry at work and all this stuff, but in some ways it's also really scary sometimes.
Oh, absolutely.
And like you said, even Falkor, just like the way that he talks, the way that it's just all pretty freaky when you're a kid.
Yeah. And we covered Enemy Mine, I think, by the same director, and had a lot of similar effects.
Yeah, Wolfgang Peterson.
And I'll be interested to actually go back to the more well-known version, more well-known movie. Anyway, excited for that. But we got to talk about Artax, the horse.
Yes.
So Artax the horse talks in the book. I don't remember him talking in the movie. I could be wrong about that, but I don't remember him talking. He's talking to Atreyu, and he starts getting super depressed because apparently he's walking in the Swamp of Sorrow, and he starts sinking in, and he's like losing all will to live. And Atreyu is like, I don't feel that way. What's going on? And they're like, oh, you're protected by the medallion that the Empress, the childlike Empress gave you. And I don't. It's so weird. He's just like sinking, and Atreyu's like, let me help you. And he's like, no, leave me be. It's too late for me. I'm gone. And he's like, half of his horse head is like covered in muck. And he's like, one request: leave and don't see me die. It'll be too sad. And Atreyu's like, okay. Turns around. And
well,
leaves.
he does say, like, he attempts to give him the amulet, and he's like, no, I don't want you to risk it, like this happening to you too. But God damn if it isn't sad.
I mean, he's sad, and like Bastian is weeping in the real world, so it is supposed to be a sad moment. But it's a weird moment, and it comes out of nowhere. And
definitely doesn't hit me like it used to when I was a kid. I'll say that, but still, some deep-seated stuff there.
Yeah, and in some ways it's like darker. Like, I don't know, something about seeing the horse in the movie is very traumatic. Like, a lot of people like talk about that scene. So I'll be curious to compare the two, but having him talk the whole time and sort of narrate his own, like, well, here I go. I'm a lost cause now. I'm sinking in. Better just leave me behind. It was really weird. Very, very weird moment. I mean, so much happens. Like, I feel like we're flying by all kinds of stuff, but it's like, it's so many times like Atreyu and then later Bastian are like just like encountering some big fantasy creature and having a conversation with it. Like, this big turtle. And every time they like basically gives them like a breadcrumb of like, this is the next place you need to go to get this next thing you need. And a lot of the story works that way. And so it has this sort of adventure feel throughout.
I liked getting more of the world. I liked fleshing it out in this way. The childlike Empress is an interesting character, and the interesting idea of having this like ancient entity sort of be benevolent and like seeing over all, and yet she's like losing her power seemingly, or like dying. She's
like a figurehead too. I actually liked it because I was thinking about how in so much of our fantasy, it's sort of like props up the idea of a monarchy, like one just like all powerful ruler who has, everybody's best interest in mind, and how like what we should really want is like Aragorn at the end of Lord of the Rings. They want like the good king, not a destruction of the monarchy. But what's interesting here is this childlike Empress doesn't ever command anybody to do anything, really.
It's more like suggestions and...
Yeah, but then also like... Yeah, she has this like weird, like hands-off approach to everything, apparently. So she's a ruler, like more as like a figurehead, like almost a spiritual ruler. Yeah,
like a god.
Because everybody sort of worships her, and they see her as like the reason they exist. So there is some interesting like spiritualism going on here, and I'm sure depending on your faith, you may read different things into it, or lack of faith, you may look at it as more of a psychological manifestation, which is how I tended to see it, like almost Jungian stuff going on throughout this story. But it's very interesting. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and it's very layered, and would go over the head of many children, I'm sure. And speaking of this turtle, I almost said turtle like D&D.
Turtle.
This turtle, I thought it was fascinating how the turtle, I said it again, the turtle sort of embodied like nihilism, and how nothing matters, and like being old. And it was also had something to do with age. It was like, when you're as old as I am, you'll see that nothing is new, nothing matters. I've given up all hope, and very defeatist in a way, and how that is set against Atreyu's youth and optimism. I think says something about children's literature, right? And like why people find it important to impart lessons onto young people, I think, through children's literature. Like how like children are the future kind of thing, right? And like how sometimes older people can be more jaded and maybe unwilling to change, and how people who are younger still have hope and still are more able to mold, I guess. I don't know.
In a blanket statement sense, I would say, I guess.
No, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I felt like that was some of the messaging being layered in here.
Could be.
I think it's something you have to fight against as you get older, right? Like you have to fight against getting too set in your ways and unwilling to learn and unwilling to grow anymore. And to me, if I ever felt like I've arrived as a person, I have no more growth to have, like then I'm doomed to failure at that point. Like we should always be trying to improve ourselves, and I think that's a lifelong endeavor.
So two things that before we move to the next part is I think there was like an oracle of some kind. I thought that was the person who was really old for some reason, or was it I can't remember.
There's a lot of really old characters.
Yeah.
I'll just say that. I think the oracle is also old.
Anyway, eventually Atreyu gets to the point where he sees Falkor like captured by this like spider thing, and I couldn't help but think of Shelob. And just this idea of having a spider creature in your fantasy story.
Yeah. Well, it was like a spider thing, but also like, wasn't it like an air elemental kind of thing too? Like it had many different shapes, and I don't know.
Well, they go, so they do the thing with it could be, but they also do the thing with the spider that eventually they get on Falkor and then they fly up in the sky, and then there's like 4 giant air elementals like fighting each other.
Yeah. So that happens.
There's that too. I don't know.
Yeah. And then he loses the thing, and we already talked about it in the we can't go over everything that happens. I'm just realizing that right now. It's just not possible. It'll take too long. One thing before we move on, this introduction of a figure outside the book, right? This is where it first gets introduced. And it's like, we need somebody to name the Empress. And all of a sudden, like, the spotlight shifts to Bastian, right? And he's like, wait a minute, who are they talking about? And he starts to go, well, it can't be me. I just thought that was a really interesting fourth wall breaky moment where the story comes alive and says, like, the savior that we've been looking for is actually you, the reader, and points at Bastian. And I don't know, that was a very, like, whoa moment for me. And I think where it deals with this is going to be the biggest change, right? Like, going forward, what happens with Bastian, I assume in the movie, I have very little memory of it, compared to what happens in the book, I think is going to be the biggest departure.
Yeah. I can't remember how it's dealt with. I just know, I can't remember, honestly. I think there's some in and out. I don't remember how specifically they engage with him in that way, but I mean, these are some of my favorite parts, is when he's like, he like gets the name right away. He's like, if I was to name it would be Moonchild, like right away. He's like engaging with it and thinking like, oh, if I could do something, I would do this. And that's a trend for a little while here.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, we've kind of gotten into what happens next, I'm realizing. So let me go ahead and read the next section. As Falkor and Atreyu search for the borders of Fantastica, Atreyu is flung from Falkor's back in a confrontation with the 4 wind giants and loses Arin in the sea. Atreyu lands in the ruins of Spook City, the home of various creatures of darkness. There, Atreyu finds the wolf Gamork, chained and near death, who tells him that all the residents of the city have leapt voluntarily into the nothing. The Fantasticans there are becoming lies in the human world. The wolf also reveals that he is a servant of the force behind the nothing and was sent to prevent the Empress's chosen hero from saving her. Gamork reveals that when the princess of the city discovered his treachery against the Empress, she imprisoned him and left him to starve. When Atreyu announces that he is the hero, the wolf laughs and succumbs to death. However, Gamork's body seizes Atreyu's leg in his jaws. Meanwhile, Falkor retrieves Arin from the sea and arrives in time to save Atreyu from the nothing. Falkor and Atreyu go to the childlike Empress, who assumes that they have brought her rescuer. Bastian suspects that the Empress means him, but cannot bring himself to believe it. When Bastian refuses to speak the new name for the Empress, to prompt him into fulfilling his role as savior, the Empress herself locates the old man of the Wandering Mountain, who possesses a book also entitled The Neverending Story, which the Empress demands he read aloud. Bastian is amazed to find that the book he is reading is repeating itself. Only this time, the story includes Bastian's meeting with Coriander, his theft of the book, and all his actions in the attic. Realizing that the story will repeat itself forever without his intervention, Bastian names the Empress Moonchild and appears with her in Fantastica, where he restores its existence. The Empress has also given him Arin, on the back of which he finds the inscription, "Do what you wish." Okay.
The end.
Yeah. I mean, the moment where the guy's reading the book and he starts off and he's like reading about this bookstore and this child coming into it, and Bastian goes, well, this isn't how the book began. And then he realizes that it's like no, this is the story of how you found the book. And the way he's like written into the story, I just think it's super cool. Like it's like
it's so good,
very meta moment, because like you expect it to start over within the story world, but no, it starts over the actual book. And then that truly fourth wall breaking, whenever it says maybe someone else is reading it right now and we don't even know, like that was like talking to us, right? Like the readers.
Yeah, I love it.
And like, you know, that's the book we're holding in our hands. That's how it begins. And we're reading all of this. So it sort of starts to include us in the story in a way. It invites us in, and in sort of a meta way. I think it's really interesting that Bastian, he is in the quote unquote real world, right? And it's only once he is able to embrace the story and like allow himself to sort of chase his imagination and recognize that he is a piece of the story, is he able to enter the story. And in the same way, like, he is technically fictional and a part of the book we're reading.
Right.
So it makes sense that he's able to do that. Yeah. That's the only way he's able to do that. But the implication is that if we, as the reader, were also able to do this, we ourselves would be able to enter this book. So I could see people, like, getting super into this idea of, like, we just gotta believe enough to enter Fantastica.
You didn't believe enough, apparently. Nothing else happened from
Did
here
you
on
enter
for you?
Fantastica?
Yeah. It's what's considered an eighth wall break. So we're breaking the fourth wall in that book.
Did you wind up in the land of the, like, lost emperors or whatever, wearing a lampshade on your head, walking
just a
around?
Zombie for a bit. Yeah.
The Old Man of Wandering Mountain. So many old characters, like I said. And then, yeah, Bastian goes in, names her Moonchild, which, like, I understand that was probably a translation thing, but, like, whenever I hear the term Moonchild, I just think of, like a hippie thing, right? Wasn't it like a hippie thing? I don't know. It felt very hippie to me.
Yeah, something like that. I guess to go back to something we talked about before, was getting a lot of, like, Native American, like, sort of things that were like our main character, or one of the main characters, Atreyu. He's like a green skin, which is like kind of could be a shift from something that's offensive about Native American people.
Well, and he has like a vision where he's talking to a buffalo, I think,
right?
Stuff like that.
Yeah, and then there's the whole, like, is he sitting crisscross applesauce, but he calls it something different, and, like, so, like, a lot of that going on.
He uses the term Indian style, which is not what we should be saying, and it's not what people say today, but I understand that maybe in the time he didn't know any better. That's my assumption, if I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt.
Right. So there, like, I can definitely see maybe Moonchild he's like, pulling that as something that he wanted to do.
Well, and he wrote this in 1979, right? And I'm sure he was affected by the 60s and early 70s and what was going on with all that. But again, it's German, so maybe Moonchild, means something different in German.
Something different. Yeah, totally. Could be. We should talk about Gmork, the wolf.
Yeah.
Definitely, because this is the thing that when I was a kid made this too scary for me to watch at certain points in my life.
I don't really remember Gmork.
So we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it more in the movie, but specifically, this is so terrifying to me. This, like, embodiment of like evil almost. And then it doesn't happen exactly the same in the movie, obviously, but I think we should definitely talk about, like, him getting trapped and then Falkor eventually coming to rescue him. And, like, the conversation that Gmork has, and, like, does that represent something to you? Like, what were you thinking about that stuff?
Remind me some of the stuff he says, I guess.
So he basically just saying, like, it doesn't matter that he's going to die first. He's going to have an ending. And then Atreyu, because he's going to be brought into the nothing, like, will never have an ending. Like because Gmork dies, he'll have an actual ending. And then this idea that, like, even in death, he, like, clamps onto Atreyu to, like, get whatever vengeance. And do we get a ton of the idea of the motivations behind the nothingness? Because Gmork says specifically that they're sent by the person who's behind the nothing or whatever. Yeah. So
I don't know. No, I feel like we didn't get a lot of that insight. But again, to me, the nothing sort of represents not only depression, but also, like, non-existence. And what you were saying, like, Gmork dies and he has an end to his story. And that story itself is a lasting thing. Stories have this power and they're eternal in a way. But non-existence and deletion is something to be dreaded, I think, here. And that's what's facing Atreyu with the approach of the Nothing. Like, this will destroy him and any legacy, I guess, something you talked about in our last episode. He has no lasting, like, he'll never be remembered. He just won't exist anymore. And just in a meta way, thinking about the idea of a written story and the big bad of the written story being deletion, literally like being removed from existence. I don't know. It's very weird to think of an author writing this and knowing that they have the power to delete at any moment, and sort of imbibing their characters with life and making them not want to be deleted. And like, I could see maybe this was like this just seems like a trippy experience to try and write a story like this.
Well, and that leads us right into the next section, if you wanted to start that, but specifically with like do what you wish, and like this idea of like creation and how, you can also, it's almost like a surrogate thing where it's saying like you can also create stories, and Bastian said to have that skill, like be a storyteller.
Okay, so let's get into it, and this is gonna be the last chunk. It's a big one. For each wish, Bastian loses a memory of his life. Unaware of this at first, Bastian goes through Fantastica, having adventures and telling stories while losing his memories. In spite of the warnings of Atreyu, Bastian uses Auron to create creatures and dangers for himself to conquer, which causes some negative side effects for the rest of Fantastica. After being abetted by the wicked sorceress Zaid, and with the mysterious absence of the childlike Empress, Bastian decides to take over Fantastica as Emperor. During his coronation ceremony, he is stopped by Atreyu, whom Bastian grievously wounds in battle. Bastian then enters the Old Emperor City, inhabited by human beings who came to Fantastica earlier but could not find their way out, eking out a meaningless existence there. A repentant Bastian is reduced to two memories, that of his father and that of his own name. After more adventures, Bastian must give up the memory of his father to discover that the strongest wish is to be capable of love and to give love to others. On the verge of losing his final memory, Bastian is unable to find the water of life with which to leave Fantastica with his memories. Here, he is found by Atreyu. In remorse, Bastian lays down Auron at the feet of his friend, and Atreyu and Falkor enter Auron with him, where the water of life demands to know Bastian's name, and if Bastian has finished all the stories he began in his journey, which he has not. Only after Atreyu gives Bastian's name and promises to complete all the stories for him does the water of life allow Bastian to return to the human world. After drinking the water of life, Bastian returns to his original form and feels comfortable and happy with it. He returns to his father, where he tells the full tale of his adventures and thus reconciles with him. Afterwards, Bastian confesses to Coriander about stealing his book and losing it, but Coriander denies ever owning such a book. Coriander reveals he has also been to Fantastica, and that the book has likely moved into the hands of someone else, and that Bastian, like Coriander, will eventually show that individual the way to Fantastica. Okay, so that's the rest of the book. I like how in that summary itself it was like, and then he has more adventures. Those adventures are significant. Like, there's so many things that happen in this.
It's another that was half the book that you just read the
That's
summary
half the
for.
book, yeah. Like, at least
not
half
a third
the
of the book. That's half the book.
Yeah. And so many things happen. There's all this stuff that happens almost as like a creation, as like the whole sort of world of Fantastica is gone, and he enters and he's in this garden and he's speaking with this lion. And he ends up almost creating Fantastica out of boredom. He's like, I want to go back there, and he wishes for it. And he's starting to learn of his powers within this world, and he learns he has the power to wish things into existence.
There's literally like a grain of sand or something from Fantastica that's like remaining, and then he like proliferates it out and creates vegetation.
Yeah, he almost has this Big Bang moment, right, where it's just like all this stuff starts growing out of it. So it's more like plant-like, and it grows like while he's asleep, and like, and he's making these wishes. So there is like this undercurrent of like feeling a lot of shame about your body, but I think it's cast as like a shame. Like he it's bad that he feels that way, and he shouldn't. But I don't know. I was getting some of that like
I think by the end it was.
yeah,
Right?
right. But like he also like he just desperately wants to be like a good-looking, strapping young lad instead, and so he becomes that in this fantasy version of himself. And he starts getting like everything he wants when he's in this fantasy world. He can just basically wish things into existence. He's like, oh, I want to be brave, so I need to have something to fight against. I want to be, you know what I mean? Like he just like starts inventing problems for himself because he gets bored. And he is this like kid with god powers, essentially. And he's extremely powerful. And when you have a character who is like literally a godlike character able to just like bend reality to their whim, that is inherently a difficult character to write in a way that is going to be super interesting, I think. And because of that, I think,
especially for an extended period of time,
I think
like
it was
this.
a mistake to spend so long in this state. This is the part of the book that should have been truncated. I think if you know, for what it's worth, I believe the second half of the book could still be just as powerful with some significant whittling down. Because a lot of the adventures he goes on, some of them are cool and have certain sort of moral moments that are interesting, but other ones, I don't know, they just don't feel like they really have a place, and it just felt like padding or like he's telling himself the story. Now, I'm not saying I would necessarily change it, like, because I like that this is a thing that exists in time, and I think it's a cool piece of art we can look at now. So I'm not trying to say we should change this book or anything. I'm just saying for people going forward who maybe are trying to write stories of their own, it's something to watch out for, is that you can, if you're dealing with a character like this in this moment of just supreme power, it's difficult to sustain that for half a book. A long.
It reminds me of like Neo in the Matrix, when he like, you know, when he like becomes one with the Matrix, whatever it is, when he like is all powerful.
Yeah,
it's
he's
like
not
really
as interesting
tough.
in the later movies, right?
Right.
Yeah,
And that can happen.
Yeah. It is very much like that in the sense that he has this power over the Matrix. Yeah, I wonder if the Wachowskis would you know, say that there's any sort of inspiration there. Very
I
interesting.
wonder if they were singing the theme song while they were writing this, while they were working on the script.
Yeah. One thing that I do really like also is how the nature of past and memory is so important going forward. And throughout the book, he sort of learns that as with every memory he loses a piece of himself. And as the more of himself he loses, the more he's unable to go forward. And like his wishes are all powerful in this world, yet the less he remembers and the more he uses his power, he forgets. The less he remembers, the less use there is for his wishes, the less that he can like do right with them, because he doesn't understand what the benefit is anymore. And you take that, and you also take the sort of the fictional beings leaping into the nothing and turning themselves into lies to enter our world. And there's just a lot being said about the nature of stories and the nature of our interaction with them and what we can learn from them and how we should sort of approach them. Think about Inda growing up with Nazism and how, I mean, I'm sure propaganda and lies were a constant thing that he saw everywhere in fictions that people were inventing and other people were believing, and it were deadly. And so I think when he's looking at like the power of stories, he's recognizing that there's this great power of good, but then there's also this danger. And it was interesting that the idea of the lies is like the stories themselves choosing to come out with some sort of agenda turns them into lies, whereas there was like a more holistic way of doing it where like they're welcomed out by the human. I don't know, there's like it's very surreal. It's like all this like stuff that's very meta and like metaphorical and turning it literal, which is very fascinating.
And I think as a kid, it would have also gone over my head. You know, I'd just be like, okay.
Yeah, this is a children's book. You know, like all that being said, you know, which is pretty wild. But there's